Good afternoon. My name is Cameron McElhenney, and I serve as the Director of Training and Education for the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. I'd like to welcome you to our final event in NACOLE's 2017 webinar series, where today we'll be discussing justice-based policing. Before I turn things over to today's facilitator and presenter, I'd like to go over a few things regarding today's call. During the webinar, all attendees will be muted. As soon as we have begun, however, you will have the ability to type in any questions you might have for Chief McCurdy. When we come to the question and answer portion of the webinar, your questions will be asked and answered as they have been received. During the webinar, you may also send any questions you might have for me as the webinar administrator in the same manner, and I will answer your questions as quickly as possible. At the conclusion of the webinar, each of you will be given the opportunity to complete a brief survey on today's event. If you could please take a few moments to complete the survey, it will help us as we move forward with enhancing and expanding our webinar series. With our housekeeping duties out of the way, I'd like to introduce you to today's facilitator, Jana Lewis, a NACOLE board member, a co-chair of the Training, Education, and Standards Committee, and Deputy Ombudsman at the Office of the King County Ombudsman. Jana?
Thank you, Cammie. Good morning or good afternoon to everyone out there. Today I have the pleasure of introducing you to Chief McCurdy. He is a chief at the King County Sheriff's Office, currently serving in the city of Covington. He's been a law enforcement officer since 1991 and been with police officer in Washington State since 1996. He's served in many capacities as a patrol officer, field training officer, master police officer, special assault unit detective, patrol sergeant, internal investigation sergeant, where I met him, training unit sergeant, and is currently, as I said, chief of police out in Covington. Andy teaches a variety of topics. One of the things he does teach that I was hoping he will share with all of you today is his knowledge of procedural justice and as it relates to law enforcement. And so there you go, Andy. Please teach us what you know.
Thank you, Jana. So as you said, my name is Andy McCurdy. You'll notice that the title of this presentation today is Justice-Based Policing, Integrating Procedural Justice into Police Culture. The name Justice-Based Policing is just something that we made up because we were concerned that the procedural justice sounded a little too academic for a lot of street-level police officers, and we wanted to really focus on specific areas of procedural justice to make sure that line staff, police officers would be more likely to integrate into their culture and the way they do things. So justice-based policing and procedural justice are two terms I'm going to use somewhat interchangeably. Justice-based policing is the specific name of the training that we have used in the King County Sheriff's Office as a way to teach procedural justice. So that's just to kind of make clear what those terms are for today. I'm going to go through a little bit here with the course purpose. My goal is to create a broader awareness of procedural justice and its core principles. In doing so, I know that a lot of you are probably familiar with the idea of procedural justice, but I do want to cover a little bit about what I think is a unique way that we in the King County Sheriff's Office have been teaching this topic and trying to integrate it into the culture. So I just want to kind of make sure we have a same understanding of what I mean when I say procedural justice. So moving forward that we have some common terminology and perspectives on it. I also want to discuss some strategies for implementing procedural justice into our culture. One of my concerns about the concept of procedural justice as it relates to law enforcement is that it's a well-studied idea. I believe that a lot of the training programs that are out there do a good job of explaining that idea, but I have concerns that the concept hasn't really been integrated into our culture as a way to change the way we do things. So we've tried to be very practical in how we've implemented in the King County Sheriff's Office. I'm going to talk a little bit today about how we've done that in hopes that some of your agencies or agencies you work with may be able to learn a little bit from it. I'm also going to talk today about some of the failures that I specifically have had in implementing it, and it is a way that hopefully you can avoid some of those pitfalls as you move forward as well. So those are the two goals today. Again, kind of standardizing how we define the term procedural justice and use it for law enforcement, and then also talk about how to implement it. A little bit of an overview. I'm going to do a brief introduction. I'm going to talk about what we measure and why that matters. We're going to talk about what is legitimacy And again, the goal of that is to kind of make sure that we are all on the same page with how we define these terms and use them. We're going to talk about how people determine satisfaction, specifically with law enforcement. And then we're going to talk about using procedural justice as an officer survival strategy. I think that one of the pitfalls I see in how these trainings have been presented is if it's presented only as a way of teaching a academic or research topic, I think that the officers who need to hear the message most are least receptive to it. So we actually have used it as a tool to increase survival, both in the short and long term, and I think it's been more accepted because of that. Also talk a little bit about when to apply procedural justice. We're going to talk about the leadership perspective, which I personally think is the most critical to success of implementing this in your agency. And then I'm going to talk about some programs and policies, specifically for my agency and some of the agencies I've worked with in implementing this to hopefully give you guys some practical tools to walk away with. My goal is to talk for about 45 minutes, and I may end abruptly. Hopefully I'll be able to cover all the material that I hope to cover today, and then hopefully we'll have a good 15 minutes to have questions and answer and so on. I'm also very open to emails, calls, or anything else that you may have if I can help at all. This is something I'm very passionate about because I truly see it as an opportunity to fix some of the issues that we have currently in law enforcement and legitimacy with the public and their perspectives. So anything I can do to support other agencies in making things better, I'm more than happy to help. So also, as Jana will tell you, I've been very active with NACOLE and also with our local police oversight groups, because I truly believe that the collaborative approach between law enforcement and those who would oversee what we do is really the only way to move forward and improve our relations with the public and increase not only satisfaction but also trust and officer safety. So a little bit of introduction, a little bit about me. One of the stories I like to tell whenever I talk to the public is to kind of personalize why I do what I do and kind of my perspective on things. In order to do so, I need to go way back and tell you a brief story about my earliest memory in life. And when I was 4 years old, I have an older brother who was about 7 at the time. My father was a police sergeant in Hayward, California, and Hayward at the time, was the 1970s, was one of the first agencies in that area to have its own SWAT team for kind of a medium-sized police department. So I was 4 years old and my brother was 7, and my mom had been a police officer and had quit to stay home and raise my brother and I. And my mom had something she had to do for the weekend, so she asked my dad if she could watch my brother and I. So he said, of course, he had some equipment maintenance to do for the SWAT team, so he would just take us to work with him. So my brother and I went to work with my dad, and when we arrived there, we found out the equipment maintenance was actually a hostage rescue scenario, and my brother and I were going to be the hostages. So my dad and the SWAT team, there's a picture of my dad way back in the 70s rappelling off of a tower in some training with the SWAT team. But my dad, basically my brother and I were held as mock hostages underneath the table in the detective bureau on the 3rd story of the police department. And I remember there were a bunch of dignitaries kind of lining one wall that were watching this demonstration of the capabilities of the SWAT team. All of a sudden, at some point, the door busted open and the SWAT team came rushing in, and they neutralized the bad guy that was holding my brother and I hostage. And then they evacuated my brother and I out onto the roof so we could be saved, basically. Kind of a cool weekend for a 4-year-old, pretty exciting. But when we got out on the roof, I noticed there was a bunch of ropes hanging off of the building. And all of a sudden, the SWAT team started rappelling down the 2 stories to the ground, to the parking lot below. And it got to the point where it was just my brother and I and my dad left. And my dad looked at us and said, "Okay, boys, time to go." And he ties my brother up to the rope and throws him off the building. And my brother rappelled down to the SWAT team down on the ground cheering for him. And then he tied me up on the rope. And I still remember to this day, my dad had huge hands. He was a big guy. And he held me by the scruff of the neck. He tied me up to the rope and held me over the edge of the building. I looked up at him, and I remember saying, I said, "Dad, I don't want to do this." And he had a big smile on his face and said, "Too late." And he let go, and I just zipped down to the bottom of the rope. Well, I still remember that the guy at the bottom of the rope that caught me was just this huge, muscular guy. He's like 6'5", 280 pounds of solid muscle. He's a motorcycle officer with a shaved head and very stoic person. But if you were to look at him, an average citizen were to look at him, he's kind of the stereotype of what a police officer is, kind of a big, brute-looking guy. But I knew him as a very sweet and gentle human being. I had spent my whole life growing up around this guy. When we had our fence blow down in a windstorm, he'd come by and help my dad put it back up. He was in my living room, sometimes, with tears in his eyes, talking to my dad about issues he was having at home or at work, and my dad was kind of mentoring him, counseling him through those things. So I felt so safe being caught by this guy at the bottom of the rope, and it had nothing to do with his physical stature, and it had everything to do with the gentle, sweet, and protective human being I knew him to be. I had a very unique upbringing because I've been around cops my whole life, and I know cops to be a very sweet and gentle and compassionate group of people. And I think that one of the problems we have in law enforcement today is that we don't get credit for that with the public. When the public sees us in our uniforms, they assume that we're all the same and that we have all the same perspectives and backgrounds and opinions, and that couldn't be further from the truth. I think that our own training and the way we've done things, kind of the Joe Friday approach to writing reports and taking information has perpetuated this myth that police officers are a certain type of person. And I believe it's been my mission to try to humanize who we are as police officers and make sure people understand that we're not robots, that just because we have the same uniform doesn't mean that we all have the same ideas and perspectives. So a lot of the training that I do is coming from that viewpoint. So again, there on your screen is a picture of my dad rappelling as a SWAT team member. There's my mom and dad. My mom was a deputy with the Alameda County Sheriff's Office, and my dad was with Hayward Police. He was with Oakland Police Department in Hayward. He retired out of Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office. There's my brother actually on a Christmas seeing my dad in uniform, and growing up with a dad who is kind of, everybody has looks up to somebody in their life that was a hero, and moving forward now and being a police officer, I look back at the days and the values that my dad taught me about how to be a cop, and I think a lot of who I am today was from that. So I think it's important to talk about this whenever I present, because I think I need to make sure people understand that, as a police officer, I'm also a human being. And again, I think going back, we've done ourselves a disservice by not focusing on that as police officers. So measure what matters. The next thing I want to talk about here is about how we as police officers or police administrators start to look at what's important and what people really care about. And I'll tell you right now that in law enforcement today, we're more effective than we've ever been in the history of law enforcement. By almost every measure, we are catching more criminals, we're convicting more criminals, we're doing a better job of investigating, we have better training, better equipment, more technology, and so on. So by almost all of the measures we traditionally look at, crime rates, 911 response times, all of these things that we as police chiefs love to produce to show our city councils and our county councils and our mayors and everyone else that we're effective, we're doing really good today. The concern that I have is public's perception of our legitimacy, public's perception and trust of us as police officers has not kept pace with our increases in effectiveness. My big concern is, as a police chief, if I know what people really care about, and yet I continue to measure these outcomes like crime rates, 911 response times, and so on, that I'm not focusing or placing value on the things that people really care about. I like to use the story, we always talk about how quickly we get to a call, and 911 response time is a really important indicator of how effective we are. But I really don't care how quickly a cop gets to the scene if he's going to act like a jerk when he gets there. So really, if I know what people care about is how they're treated, I really could care a lot less about these other stats and all this other data. What I really care more about is how does the public perceive our actions, our decisions, and what we do. When we use the term legitimacy, or we use the term public perception, or when we talk about procedural justice, really what I'm talking about is focusing on how people view our decisions, how people view the actions of our police officers. And again, all of these other things are great to look at to know whether or not we're able to catch bad guys, because that is our primary function. But we need to do so in a way that's respectful and actually increases public trust and respect, and not in a way that undermines it. So let's talk about that term. I'm using the term legitimacy just so that we're on the same page. Let's use the same definition. The definition we use when we present training on this idea of procedural justice, justice-based policing, or legitimacy, is the public views the police as entitled to exercise authority in order to maintain social order, manage conflicts, and solve problems in the community. I like to use very practical terms, especially when I'm teaching police officers. It's not because I think that they're not smart. but I think cops, by their very nature, are very practical, and I think that painting a picture for them is a much more effective way of making a point. So when I talk about this idea of legitimacy, I give them this dictionary definition, but I tell them that really what legitimacy is when I come pulling up to a call in my billboard police car and I step out and I'm wearing my uniform with my badge and my gun, does the public think I have a right to be there? And does the public think I have a right to tell them what to do? If the answer to both those questions is yes, then I have high legitimacy in that community. If the answer to that question is no, then I have concerns about trust and legitimacy, and I need to fix those. So again, when I pull up to a scene, does the public think I have a right to be there, and do they think I have a right to tell them what to do? My goal is to capture the trust of more people and increase legitimacy, and hopefully get answers of yes to both of those questions. So what shapes the view of legitimacy among people? It's very simple. They ask themselves, are police exercising their authority in a fair and just way? That exercising of authority, the process of decision making, that is procedural justice. So when we talk about procedural justice, it's the thought process that we go through, how we explain ourselves to the public, whether or not we listen to people. All of that it plays into this idea of procedural justice. The goal of procedural justice is to increase legitimacy and compliance. So what else do people look at? So if we look at the idea of legitimacy, and what they're really looking at is, are they being treated in a fair and just way? The other thing we have to talk about is the satisfaction. So in law enforcement today, there's a lot of factors that influence people's perception of their satisfaction. The two main issues that people look at are their perception of their quality of life and their personal experiences with the police. Those are the two main factors that they weigh. And this goes not just for police, but for government in general, but specifically with procedural justice for law enforcement. One of the issues we talk about in this training that we do for police officers is people's perception of their quality of life. If they have a low perception of quality of life in America today, typically people blame government for that low quality of life. Oftentimes people with low perception of their quality of life are unemployed, have a criminal record, may not have a stable family environment, often live in a low income area and are surrounded by other people who are struggling. There's domestic violence in their past, maybe even victims of sexual assault. People with their low perception of the quality of life. The factors that feed into that perception of quality of life are rarely impacted by police officers. We may come in and we may make an arrest. We may shift crime from one neighborhood to another. But in reality, most of the things that truly affect somebody's perception of quality of life are things like poverty, things like race. In our country today, there's a lot of institutional either racism or imbalance there that gives certain people advantages in life that other people don't get to appreciate. And when you're a person who doesn't appreciate those advantages in life, oftentimes in America today, we seem to blame our government. Well, the problem we have is the most visible representative of government is the police. And when there's a problem, the police come in there and they try to, often like a wrecking ball, come in there and try to solve that problem. And our solutions from a law enforcement perspective are very short-term solutions. We are not able to go in there and fix a lot of these issues with poverty, racism, and so on. We can easily come in there and make it a lot worse with the way we handle things. But one of my big concerns is when we talk about determining satisfaction, if one of the main factors that people consider when they determine whether or not they're satisfied with us is something that's almost entirely out of the control of the police, and yet that's what people are using to determine whether or not they're satisfied, it can become very frustrating for police officers. The other thing people consider when they determine whether or not they're satisfied is their personal experiences with the police. Now, that would be great if their personal experiences was actual experience, but you have to realize that when we say personal experience with the police, often that personal experiences is not their direct experience, but stories they've heard from friends or family. It's something they've seen on social media or something that they've seen in the news. And often those stories, I mean, obviously if you're being arrested by the police and you tell your family about it, it's a self-serving, but normally you're not going to tell an accurate story about what happened. So typically people get an unbalanced view of the police, partly because these personal experiences with them are often slanted toward the negative. So when we do this training for police officers, it can be very overwhelming for police officers today to face this idea that when they go into a neighborhood, when they go in there with every goal of trying to help and make things better, They know that the people that they're interacting with are to a large degree going to determine their satisfaction based on factors that that police officer who's there at that moment has very little control over. And that's further complicated by the fact that typically when we respond to these calls, especially in low-income, high-crime areas, the only time we go into these neighborhoods is when there's a crisis. So we're dealing with people who we don't know, who are strangers to us, who have a low perception of the quality of life. They've either had direct or indirect negative experiences with the police, and then we come storming in there and we try to fix things, right? And when you're talking about crisis, we have emotions, we have frustrations, we have all these things bubbling to the surface. We have fear as a main driving factor for our decisions. And on both sides of that, people are fearful because they don't know and trust each other. A big part of this training today, you have to realize, in my perspective, it comes from this idea that we need to be in these neighborhoods making friends, building trust before there's a crisis. Because if we wait until there's that crisis event that calls us there, then we're only working against ourselves to build trust. I personally have a lot of programs that I run where I get into areas where we typically have a lot of police calls, try to build relationships that are totally unrelated to law enforcement. If for no other reason, I want people to know me as a person, trust me as a person, and then also know that I'm a police officer. And I always hope that because I have a relationship with people who may not have ever met a cop unless they were the police were in their neighborhood for a crisis, hopefully the fact that they have a relationship with a police officer and know and trust me will make that officer's job a little easier when they get there and try to handle things. Giving us the benefit of the doubt or having a little bit of at least reducing some of the negative stereotypes of police by building relationships, I think is very, very important. So anyway, this is the issue we have, though, is determining satisfaction. Cops get very frustrated. When I do training for police officers and I talk about this idea of satisfaction, it is very overwhelming for officers. So what I tell them is you may have very little impact across the country about public's perception to the positive. It's really easy to do something that can increase negative perception of the police. But you can have a huge impact as a police officer in the way you handle people in a one-to-one encounter. And if you do certain things with that person in that moment, even if they hate or distrust the police, you can still do a lot to maintain voluntary compliance and get them to do what you need them to do, even if both of these issues that they typically consider when they determine satisfaction are working against you. So really what we talk about here is when we have those one-to-one encounters, person's assessment is really what they're looking at is the outcome of your decisions plus the process that you went through. Typically, as I showed on that earlier slide, most of the measures that we traditionally have used in law enforcement to look at whether or not we're doing a good job are outcome-based measures. How many calls did we have? What's our crime rate? What's our 911 response time? But the reality is, without also looking at the process and how we treat people in that process, our assessment is skewed, and it's skewed away from what people really care about. Again, outcome is a factor, but it's far less important than how we treat people in the process. So when I teach this to police officers, we call our course in King County Sheriff's Office, we call it Justice-Based Policing, Communication Skills for Officer Survival. And every time we talk about procedural justice, we talk about how using these skills, building trust and increasing legitimacy, makes police officers safer. The officers we seem to have trouble with on this, oftentimes will use the excuse, well, being nice might make me unsafe, or showing respect makes me weak, and then somebody's going to exploit that weakness. What we show officers, though, is that a person who's voluntarily compliant is not dangerous to them. If anything you can do to increase voluntary compliance is going to increase trust and legitimacy, is going to keep you safer. So when we talk about this, one of the things we tell them is whenever we talk about procedural justice, we talk about public trust, we talk about legitimacy, whenever we're missing that, the first thing to go is the officer, community member safety. Whenever we have that distrust, whenever we have these emotional situations, if one or both of these parties don't trust each other, then it becomes dangerous. They can spiral out of control very quickly. So we always focus our training when we talk to police officers on the fact that building trust is going to increase their safety. The reality is a police officer cannot make good decisions if they're afraid. A police officer cannot make good decisions if they feel like their personal safety is in danger. So when we look at our hierarchy of decision making, the first thing on that hierarchy of decision making is always officer safety. Because if I can put myself in a position where I'm safe, then I'm able to communicate, then I'm able to try to de-escalate. Then I'm able to use all of my tools, whether they be verbal tools, defensive tactics, or firearms, or taser. None of those tools are great if things are spinning out of control because I'm not safe. So again, focusing on using these tools to build public trust and legitimacy can increase officer safety. That's the first thing that we talk about. The second thing we talk about is that increasing trust and legitimacy means that people when in the absence of public trust and legitimacy, means that community members are less likely to cooperate and support us in our policing efforts. We cannot solve crimes without support of the public, and when we don't have the trust of the public, these crimes never even get reported, or if they do get reported, then nobody steps forward to provide information. And every community has that either development or building or neighborhood or some entire cities where there's somebody laying dead in the middle of the street, and there's 100 people standing around and nobody saw anything. In those communities, my concern is that we have a lack of trust, we have a low legitimacy, and I believe that one of the ways to fix that is to focus on process, focus on the way we treat people, focus on procedural justice. And then the third element that we talk about in this training is that when community members don't trust the police, they're less willing to invest their taxpayer dollars. We today, our staffing levels, our equipment, all of these other things that are very important to our safety and our ability to do our jobs are directly tied to whether or not the public supports us and is willing to invest it. When we have a community that's laying off police officers, the first thing I look at is why does this community not see value in their police department? Sometimes it may be because they have a low crime rate and they realize they don't need as many police officers. But oftentimes that lack of value in the eyes of the community is going to impact all of these issues like ability to solve crimes, officer safety, community member safety, because people do not see value. The best way to improve the public's perception of our value is to focus on process and how we treat people. Again, one of the exercises I do with our officers is we talk about what does officer survival mean to you. We do an entire exercise where officers are divided into groups and we have them write down what the term officer survival means to them. Traditionally in police work, the term officer survival, if you saw that on a flyer for a training, it would usually be some kind of a firearms tactics or defensive tactics training, or would show a bunch of videos of officers being killed in the line of duty. But what we try to focus on is when we talk about officer survival, it's much more broad than that. When we talk about survival, it's about being healthy and happy in your work. Anything we as a profession, and when I say profession, I lump police oversight and police officers all into the same profession because we're all about public safety. We're all about providing this service to the public. If we have happy, healthy police officers, they're much more able to make good decisions. We see less force, we see less complaints, all these things that are concerning to us. If we can really focus on keeping our officers healthy, we're going to see those things improve. So when I have these officers do this exercise, what we often see happen is officers, we have them talk about what is officer survival. They forget the fact that there are people who want to kill them because of the job that they do. And they instead focus on, having good relationships, promotional opportunities, being satisfied in your work, being a customer, community service, being able to give back to the community. They focus on all these things that make them a happy and complete officer. So it's really important. One of the reasons we do this exercise with our officers in this training is because we want to bring it back to focus on what does it mean to survive. The next step in this, after we have them define officer survival, we have them talk about challenges and stresses that impact ability, willingness, and effectiveness to do our jobs. What we have them do is we have them actually as a group identify if we just define what is officer survival, now what are the things that get in the way with that? And often what we hear is the thing that gets in the way of officer survival oftentimes is public scrutiny, how they're treated by their boss, how they're treated by their coworkers, things at home. And all of these things that may or may not even be related to work directly are going to impact their ability to do their jobs. So we start talking about how usually when something is a challenge or a stressor, it's a challenge or stressor because there's a relationship attached to it, and that relationship is missing one of the very important elements that makes it a good relationship. This is in the training that we do for the King County Sheriff's Office. This is where we start to bring out the elements of procedural justice. And I'll give you an example. We have a lot of officers talk about a divorce, right? So they look at a divorce as a challenge or stressor that impacts their ability to do their jobs. When we pull out the specifics of why that divorce is so stressful, often what we hear is, they feel powerless. They know that a judge or the spouse that they're breaking up with seems to be in a position of authority, and they're subordinate to that authority, and they feel like they don't have a voice in the process, and they feel like the whole process of decision making isn't understood by them, that it's unfair, that it's not impartial, that it's not respectful. So when you're going through that, when all of those important elements of a healthy relationship are missing, it starts to impact our ability to do our jobs. When I have them do that and I have them personalize it, I have them put themselves in a situation where they think about how the way they're being treated impacts their ability to focus on what's important. I then have them step back and I have them put themselves in the shoes of every citizen we deal with. And typically when we deal with people, we're dealing with them in a crisis or in a time of stress. And the feelings that these officers have when they're going through that divorce they may talk about is identical to the feeling the public has when they're going through this crisis. And I try to show them how to personalize it, how important it is to make sure that relationship is healthy and there's good communication in order to reduce the stress. And, the reality is those pieces that I just pulled out are the basic elements of procedural justice. So we have a kind of a roundabout way of introducing procedural justice. We do it very subtly, and we do it to personalize it so that they think about a situation where it was lacking for them as a person, and then we apply it to them in a job when they're in a position of authority. Again, I think it's important to personalize it and have officers have something to point back to, whether it be a personal relationship or a bad boss that they work for, and have them recognize that these elements are very important. We talk a lot in this training with our officers about the spectrum of encounters. Most people we deal with are compliant. There are some people who are predators who are trying to kill us because we're police officers. But really where we make our money as cops is typically is dealing with people who are difficult. And I think that one of the struggles that police officers have is telling the difference between somebody who's difficult and somebody who's a predator. The human communication is very complex, and when you're right there and you're also emotionally wrapped into the situation because you're fearful, sometimes somebody who's asking questions or resisting what you have to say may be doing it from a place where they're just resistant because they don't understand or they don't feel like they're being respectful. But oftentimes officers mistake them for somebody who's a predator trying to hurt them. So a lot of the training we do in this is we step back from the traditional tools we've used to train police officers, how to detect danger, the pre-attack indicators and such, and we start focusing more on things that are more relevant, like facial expressions, context. We talk a lot here about biases, whether they be implicit biases or confirmation bias, and different errors in human thinking that can help us put us in a position where we mistake a difficult person for a predator. And I think it's really important to have officers. In my department, we do a lot of scenario-based de-escalation training now, and one of the main purposes of doing this is to help officers do a better job of telling the difference between a difficult person and a predator. We want to make sure officers understand that there's a certain amount of resistance or questioning that needs to be allowed. Just telling somebody to do something and they don't immediately do it, you shouldn't use force unless that person is a danger to you. So we try to better prepare officers to tell the difference between difficult and predatory behavior. So we show them quite a few some images, some videos that are either of dangerous people or of difficult people, and we talk about how these are very complex two-way communications that are verbal and nonverbal communication involved, and we give them some tools about how to pick up on those types of communication to help them tell the difference. And we also talk a lot about how de-escalation is an outcome. You can do all the right things to the wrong person and not get them to de-escalate. I've seen a lot of training come out where it talks about de-escalation tactics. We talk a lot how sometimes a threat, as an example, a threat to use a gun or a taser may be a very appropriate way to de-escalate somebody in certain circumstances, but in other circumstances, it's only going to inflame that person. So we do a lot to talk about when to de-escalate, how to de-escalate. We talk about using time and distance and barriers to make you safe, or safe enough at least, to build in some time to the situation to try to de-escalate. And I think it's important to do that. When we talk about procedural justice, a lot of it is really about de-escalation, and a lot of it's about complex human communications. So we try to give them some better tools to do those things. Programs and policies. When I talk about here about how's complex communication, de-escalation, and so on, that's the street level encounters. One of the things I think is really important is when we talk about the way we enforce the law, the two primary ways of controlling crime are deterrence theory. That's when there's a sanction for violating the crime. There's also values, which is the right thing to do. And then the other primary one is legitimacy. And legitimacy is that people think that the police officers have a right to tell them what to do. Most of our programs nowadays in criminal justice are built under the deterrence theory. With traffic specifically, you can think of a lot of click it or ticket, drive hammered, get nailed, so on and so forth. 3 strikes, you're out is another example. We've been using deterrence theory for a long time, and it's not very effective. The only way for deterrence theory to be effective is if these sanctions are swift, certain, and severe. And the reality is, especially when we talk about things like traffic enforcement, we know that they are none of those. Unless we had a police officer, unless we knew that, as in a seatbelt, as an example, if you knew that it was against the law to not wear your seatbelt, and every time your car was in motion, you didn't have your seatbelt on, if you were automatically issued a citation, and that citation was for $600, we would pretty quickly get people to comply. But the reality is it's not that way. Cell phone, talking on your cell phone while driving is another good example. The fact that there's potentially a fine attached to something is not enough. If those sanctions are swift, certain, and severe, it can be more effective, but we can't guarantee that they will be. So every time you violate the law and you don't get caught, or you don't have a swift and severe punishment, it only actually encourages you to violate the law. When we talk to officers about how to reduce crime, we talk about legitimacy and how improving the perceptions of law enforcement is a good way to get a hold of these. And we start looking at even our traffic enforcement programs, and we look at how do we change people's values and how do we change people's perceptions of police in order to gain voluntary compliance. That's a huge part of how we start to shift toward this idea of procedural justice. Whenever we're talking about these things, though, we need to realize that people's perceptions of fair treatment and their willingness to comply with us requires that they perceive that police officer as unbiased, concerned about their needs, and respectful. Again, it's not about the numbers, it's not about the data, it's about how we treat people in the process. So we start looking at all of our programs and policies, and we start to ask ourselves, is this creating a situation for the officer to show that they're unbiased, concerned about their needs, and respectful? Or is it removing that and turning us back into robots, which is going to undermine the human side of us? We talk a lot about how every interaction is an opportunity to impact public trust and legitimacy for positive or negative, and those negative impacts are much broader and last a lot longer than the positive ones. So we talk to our officers about how important it is to treat those interactions as very important. The pieces of procedural justice we pull out in this training are voice in the process, preferably before the decision is made. Transparency of process. Does the person understand the process that the person is going through to make a decision? Neutrality in decision making. Do they know and feel that that decision maker is neutral, or are they biased? And respect for rights and dignity. These 4 terms are really hard to teach police officers because they're not specific and tangible enough, in my view. In the King County Sheriff's Office, we actually use a different model. We use what we call the LEAD model, L-E-E-D. If the foundation that we're trying to build on is this idea of procedural justice, and the goal is this capstone of legitimacy, then we look at the 4 pillars as listen, explain, with equity and dignity. The reason I like this acronym is because cops love acronyms, but also because I think that these 4 terms are really easy to put your finger on when you do or don't do them. We've actually started building the LEAD model into a lot of the different ways that we do things. It's actually one of the first categories rated during annual performance evaluations for all of our employees. When I have a citizen that has an interaction with an officer that they're not satisfied with, if they call me and complain and said the officer was rude, when I interview them about why they think that officer was rude, what I'm looking for is, did the officer listen? Did they give you an opportunity to tell your side of the story before they made a decision? Did they explain what they were doing? Did they explain their decision-making process? Did they treat that person with equity, or were they impartial, or were they biased? And did they treat the person with dignity and respect? It's a really good way to train our officers how to act, and it's also a good way for an agency to start measuring whether or not we're doing these things. When we do these investigations for complaints, whether it be a use of force or a rudeness complaint or you name it, These are the types of measures we want to look at just to determine whether or not the officer is performing the way we want them to. Here's a quote that I love from Tom Tyler. Tom Tyler is the preeminent researcher in areas of procedural justice for law enforcement. Skill in handling the rebellious, the disgruntled, and the hard to manage in ways that lead to compliance are the litmus test of the quality of a street officer's performance. I love that because in my career, I have a small number of officers I really hold out on a pedestal for their ability to really handle difficult people, to diffuse things, to calm people down, to get confessions, to get compliance, whatever it may be. It had nothing to do with their physical stature. It had everything to do with how they interacted with other people. And it always came down to showing people respect, truly listening to people actively, paying attention to that person. That's one way of listening, is listening to their body language to know when something you're saying is upsetting them or if it's helping gain voluntary compliance. So this is a quote that we use often in our training. It's also something we point back to in our programs and our policies as what's important to manage. What's important to measure. We talk a lot in our training about the difference between the power to control people versus the power to influence people. Traditional police training used threats of force and use of force as our primary tool for gaining voluntary compliance. But really what procedural justice is about learning how to influence people. If the only way you know how to control people is to use force or threaten to use force, if the only training you have in your department is use of force training, then when that person is not afraid of you, you have no control over them. And there are a lot of people today who are not afraid of the police, even if because they're willing to resist things on a short term, knowing that later they can try to appeal it. So we try to focus on using influence. It's really important, though. I always talk about how procedural justice is not about customer service. The public is not always right. Police work is inherently regulatory and coercive. There are times when we're going to have to take people to jail. There are times we're going to have to issue citations. Sometimes we have to kill somebody in the performance of our duties to protect ourselves or somebody else. The problem I have with looking at it as a customer service model is we shouldn't fix the outcome in order to increase satisfaction. Often when we go back and we try to change the outcome to gain satisfaction, we actually undermine our credibility. We lose trust and we lose a lot of that idea of legitimacy. It's about treating people fairly in the process. What we talk to our supervisors about is when we have a complaint, when we have a use of force, the way you go out and handle that, the way you interact with that person while you're obtaining information about that complaint or use of force plays huge into whether or not that person is satisfied at the end of the day with the services they were provided with. And again, it's not customer service. It's about giving people an opportunity to tell their side of the story. It's about being transparent in our decision making. It's about being impartial. It's about being respectful and dignified in the way we handle people. Leadership starts at home, though. Trust in our leadership determines the degree to which officers view authority as legitimate or willing to cooperate with them and work with them to achieve the mission of the organization. If we have a leadership model in our organization that does not follow procedural justice, if I'm not respectful to my officers, if I don't listen to them, if I'm not fair and balanced in my decision making, if I'm not respectful, then how can I ask my officers to go out in the field and interact that way with the public? It's really important that our leadership models mirror the model with the way we want our officers to interact with the public. So we in our agency really try to look at how we interact with our employees to support them, try to deal with performance issues as a training matter whenever possible, and reserve discipline for the most serious cases. So that legitimacy at home part, I think, is really, really important. And we're not limited by opportunity. We're limited by our leadership. So if our leaders take the reins and really start to look at how they can, sway and gain voluntary compliance from the officers that work for them, I think they're going to go in the right direction with these things. The problem is that cultural change is a lot like turning around an aircraft carrier. It doesn't happen on a dime. It takes time, and all of these ideas need to be supported by policies, training. We need to measure the right things, and we need to make sure we reward our officers when they do the right thing. The only interaction with the command that an officer has should not be when they're in trouble. And I see a lot of agencies that are set up to really run counter to these ideas of procedural justice because they don't hear much from their command until that officer makes a mistake. And again, if that's the way we interact with our officers, then that's how they're going to talk to the public. So as I mentioned before, we use the LEAD model. We use that as a training model. We use that as a way to measure performance. It's throughout our policies and procedures in how we expect officers to talk and act. We empower our employees to make decisions. We empower them to make mistakes, and then we support them when they make those mistakes, even if they have to be disciplined. Again, you can support a person without supporting their bad behavior. We look at consistent discipline. The whole idea of procedural justice is about fairness and impartiality. If you're not consistent in discipline, you can't say that you're embracing these ideas of procedural justice. We need to balance discipline and rewards. We need to look at using student-centered learning programs. Scenario-based training is the way to reinforce all of these ideas. And we need to really look at combining hard and soft skills training. A lot of agencies, when I talk about hard skills training, I'm talking about firearms training and defensive tactics. When I talk about soft skills training, I'm talking about things like communications and procedural justice. We need to have the same instructors teaching both of these programs, and we need to have them combined. You cannot be teaching how to strike somebody if you don't teach them how to create distance so that you can have an opportunity to de-escalate. Those two things need to be joined very intimately. Some of the programs that we use to do these, we use what's called the PTO model. The old way of training recruits was called FTO. PTO is a student-centered way of learning, and it empowers the student to take ownership of their own future. It also creates a lot of improvements in areas of emotional intelligence and self-awareness. Blue Courage is a program that tries to reinvigorate officers to make good decisions, to show them that they have a noble profession and try to have them act that way. CIT, or crisis intervention training, a lot of the skills we teach in procedural justice are really closely tied to CIT. And we actually use CIT funds in King County. Part of our sales tax goes toward crisis intervention training, and we actually use some of those funds to pay for procedural justice training. De-escalation, again, I think that's critical nowadays, but I think that the model for de-escalation needs to be founded in procedural justice, and the lead model or the concept of procedural justice need to be woven into how we measure whether or not officers are de-escalating. Again, I mentioned combining your hard and soft skills training and also having the same instructors teach both programs. And then I really like LPO, or Leadership in Police Organizations. Procedural justice is taught in that course. It's a 3-week-long course, and I think a lot of these concepts we're talking about today are reinforced by that. So that's some of the programs my agency has used to do this. In my agency, we've actually done procedural justice training for all, we have about 1,000 employees, 800 of them are commissioned, and all 800 commissioned officers have had this training, everybody from the sheriff all the way down to the newest officer. And we continue to offer this training monthly as part of our post-academy training. And that training is open to agencies from any other jurisdictions that want to come and do the training, and myself and a couple of the other instructors are happy to coordinate and collaborate these ideas. My last little quote here, legitimacy grows out of how police treat victims, witnesses, bystanders, people reporting crime, and those who commit crime. When they adhere to the rules, maintain neutrality, and treat people with dignity and respect, police legitimacy increases. Again, I think that these ideas are not new. These are things cops have always done. But I think we need to build programs and policies and have training to reinforce when officers are doing the right thing. The reality is, if officers don't get this, they either need to have the support and training to figure it out, or we need to have the policies in place to get rid of them. If you have any other questions or comments, here's my email address. That's also my desk telephone number. And I think we're going to open up the questions now.
Thank you so much, Andy, for that presentation. And we do have a few questions. Before I start posing them to you, I just wanted to remind everyone in the audience that if you do have a question, go ahead and type it in the chat box. And then when you send it, just make sure you choose from the drop-down list, send question to staff, and then hit send. So the first question we have is, as civilian oversight practitioners, we often come to police departments and elected officials with ideas because we don't have the power to implement or require things like this to happen. So what ways do you see as the best to implement this approach in policing?
I actually think that a lot of police oversight groups are much more powerful than you realize, but I think they have to be very skillful in applying it, because by its very nature, police work is a little bit closed off. There's a lot of us versus them kind of in the culture of how police officers are trained, and because of the interactions they typically have with groups that are critical of them. I actually believe that if you can link up the training staff from your agency with an agency like mine that has implemented this, and we can start to show them some of the value. I think that other police agencies that have done it, talking to them as peers, can go a long ways toward encouraging them to implement it. I've talked to a lot of agencies that were initially very resistant or reluctant because they were kind of being forced to do this. I've actually taught this across the country to agencies that are either being investigated by Department of Justice for pattern and practice of abuse, or they have a consent decree. And we've used this as one of the programs to try to help change that culture. And I think that once we actually get there and start teaching it, because we focus on officer safety as the main message and the main driving force behind implementing these changes, I think it's a lot easier for those agencies to accept. So I do think it's doable, and I'm happy if you contact me directly with those questions to help you with that. But I think when you have cops talking to cops, it helps. And I think when you run into cops that are friendly to these ideas, that they can do a lot to sway these other agencies to implement it.
Great, thank you. The next question is, where have you seen, and I know you touched on this a little bit, but maybe you can expand, where have you seen the most pushback from law enforcement on procedural justice training, and why do you think that is?
I think the most pushback is their perception of it before the training. I think that a lot of these officers, like in my own agency, we heard people referring to it as the hug a thug training. We heard people referring to it as, like a lot of these different terms that were, not very supportive of it. But once actually people went to the training, a lot of them walked out of it. They're like, I already do this stuff. I already know this. And what we told them is the idea behind the way we do this training is, for one thing, for those officers who don't get it, hopefully we're giving them a roadmap to be successful. But a lot of the officers who do get it, we're not getting credit for it because we do a really poor job of documenting the fact that we made these good decisions. Our incident reports are too short. Our use of force reports are too short. We don't know what words to use to describe what we're doing. Prior to this training, you would ask an officer, it's like, how do you get voluntary compliance? And they'd be like, you just talk to people. Well, there's actually science behind why talking to people in a certain way works. And officers have kind of figured it out through trial and error. And a lot of the research really just supports what good cops have already done. And I think if you present it to them that way, you kind of debunk a lot of these concerns they have about it. It's not about just being nice. It's not about customer service. It's about doing the right thing. It's about showing people we're making good decisions. And I think that it's pretty easy when you bring them in, you present it the way we do, where you really have them talk about frustrations they had in their work life or their personal life, where they were not being treated good by a supervisor or a person in a position of authority. And then you put them in the shoes of the public when we interact with them. I think it brings it home for them. And like I said, most of the resistance is before the training. Once they have the training, it's very highly rated training in our agency. And my agency does not do a lot of training, especially in the classroom. So it says a lot if this was a highly rated course. So, but yeah, the main pushback is just concerns prior to the training, I'd say.
Great. The next question that we have is, you mentioned briefly the things you look at when considering a rudeness allegation. Can you speak more about this in a little more detail? Specifically, how procedural justice can help determine if a rudeness allegation is sustained?
Well, the first step is to make sure officers understand what the expectation is. In my agency, we've used that lead model as kind of a way to set the foundation for how we should communicate with people. Now, obviously, there's going to be situations where an officer pulls up to a chaotic scene. They need to point their gun at people. They need to give really direct commands. They don't come across as very polite. And often in tactical situations, that is the appropriate response. And I'm not telling the officers they always have to have a smile on their face and be nice to people. The nature of our job requires that sometimes we be very direct. The difference, though, is when you do have that opportunity to, you have time or distance or a barrier, or you're dealing with somebody who's maybe upset but is not dangerous to you, we need to teach officers about the lead model or some version of that and how to implement it and when. Once we determine that this person who's complaining was in fact not a threat, and the officer didn't perceive them as a threat, I literally will interview that person about how that encounter went. And a lot of times, again, that person's bias and the officer's bias are often creating this conflict. If you can break that down, you can really draw out the details of that interaction. You can really find out, it's oftentimes not the words the officer used. It's not oftentimes not even the directions that were given, but sometimes just the mere fact that somebody was wearing a uniform, which is very offensive to certain people who don't respect police or don't like authority. So again, we teach officers how to minimize that by paying attention to their body language and such. In our policies, a lot of these rudeness complaints are not a violation of policy, but it's obviously in a situation where that officer needs to have a discussion with a training staff or with their supervisor about how to show the public that they're not a threat, that they're not trying to intimidate or whatever else. So again, I think it's about doing good investigations, but you need to front load that with good training for officers that really set the expectation about how they interact with the public. And oftentimes I see it where, especially with something like rudeness, it'll be like, well, don't be rude anymore. Well, what does that look like? And if you can't really tell the officer what that looks like, then how do we expect a citizen to know what's rude and what isn't? But the first thing I always ask is, did you give that citizen an opportunity to tell their side of the story before you made a decision? Even if you've made your decision, at least show that citizen that you care about their opinion and their perspective. And sometimes that requires the officer to have a lot of patience. And that officer may be having a bad day or may have just come from a really rough call, and it's really hard to have patience sometimes in those situations. But I tell my officers that patience is a requirement of this job, and obviously when it's not that crisis situation where you need to be abrupt, we need to slow things down and create room for that.
Thank you for that. I think we have time for one more question, and that is, are there any exercises you can recommend to improve relations between our police department and an oversight group such as the Citizens Review Board?
I honestly believe that one of the reasons in King County, I think I have a really good relationship with our oversight group. It's the Office of Law Enforcement Oversight. I've found that training is a really good opportunity for the two groups to kind of interact with each other. I think that if oversight groups can go in there with an open mind and really be receptive to what the officers have to say in the training environment, oftentimes they go in there and you can sense that even at the beginning of the training, if the oversight person comes in there with kind of overly hypersensitive to what the officer says and does, or has kind of an agenda behind what they're doing, it kind of can undermine that. So I would actually encourage you to participate in a lot of the training your police department offers in order to build that good relationship, in order to understand a little bit about how police officers act and how they talk, so that when you have these major incidents, you're always going to have that pre-existing relationship that's going to make that communication more on a level playing field. And so again, I think finding those opportunities to attend the training, making sure you understand what the cops are talking about, what kind of training they've received. I think the other thing you can do is focus on command decisions instead of just actions of deputies on the street or officers on the street. Oftentimes in these investigations or when we have these complaints, we get so narrowly focused on that officer in that moment, but there's so many more factors that feed into that. I would like to see police oversight focus on command and supervision before they start looking at the actions of the deputy. If that deputy goes in there and makes a bad decision or does a bad thing, was that preceded by a lack of training or poor equipment, or do they have a model of interaction within the organization that creates an environment where officers feel like it's okay to be rude or to use, only use force and threats of force as a way to gain compliance, because that's the way they're treated by their bosses. So I think that you can actually gain a lot of support of line staff by showing that you recognize that and you understand how officers feel and how they're trained and how they are taught to act. And I think you can start to nudge things in the right direction by really working in the training environment to build that relationship. So.
Thank you, Andy. I think that was a great way to end, and I want to thank you for your presentations today. I also want to thank everyone in attendance for being here and for taking a moment to complete the online survey that will be sent out shortly. Just as a quick reminder, this is eligible for the Certified Practitioner of Oversight credential towards the hours for those who are participating. It is worth 0.75 hours. Make sure to fill out your attendance form that you can find under the CPO training tab on the NACOLE website. We are currently putting together our webinar series for 2018. If you have any suggestions for future topics, please do not hesitate to send them to us. We want to make sure that we are presenting topics that will be helpful to you in the work that you're doing in your communities. Please send that information to us at info@nacole.org. That's info@nacole.org for consideration. Please watch your inbox for additional information about the upcoming webinar series, including dates and when registration will be open. We once again thank you for joining us, and we look forward to having you at future NACOLE training opportunities.